In the winter of 1904, a freight train ground to a halt on the spine of the Rocky Mountains, 11,600 feet above sea level, on a shelf of blasted rock called Rollins Pass. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero. Snow had buried the tracks to a depth that made the rails invisible. The wind, funneling across the treeless saddle of the Continental Divide, hit the stalled locomotive with a force that snapped steel cables and froze exposed skin to metal in seconds. The train sat there for 3 days. Men burned the wooden snowsheds around them, just to keep the crew alive. When the train finally crept down the far side of the pass, it had lost time, money, cargo, and very nearly human lives. And this was not an accident. This was a routine Tuesday in February. What the Colorado Rockies demanded of any railroad that tried to cross them was something close to a permanent siege. Every winter, the Continental Divide became a wall of ice, wind, and whiteout that no steel wheel could reliably breach. And yet the economic future of an entire region depended on doing exactly that, pushing trains through that wall, week after week, year after year, no matter what the mountain threw at them. The solution, when it finally came, would require 6 miles of tunnel, bored straight through the granite heart of the divide. It would take the better part of a century to fund, a decade to build, and 28 lives to finish. The mountain would give up its passage only at a cost that most people have never been told. The problem was geography, but the stakes were economic survival. Denver, by the turn of the 20th century, was a city searching for a purpose. It sat on the high plains, a mile above sea level, separated from the Pacific by the most formidable mountain barrier in North America. Every ton of freight moving between the Midwest and the West Coast either went north through Wyoming or south through New Mexico, skirting the Rockies entirely. Denver was bypassed. Its railroads ended at the foot of the mountains and went no further. The city's business leaders understood with growing urgency that if Denver could not force a direct rail line west through the divide to Salt Lake City, it would remain a regional depot, while cities with easier geography became the great interchange points of the transcontinental economy. The dream was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute. Build a railroad that went straight through the Rockies, not around them. The man who staked his fortune on that dream was David Henry Moffat. A Denver banker, mining investor, and railroad builder, Moffat had spent decades financing Western rail lines and had come to believe that a direct route from Denver to Salt Lake City was not just desirable, but inevitable. He was right about the inevitability. He was wrong about how much of his own life it would consume. Moffat poured his personal wealth into building the Denver, Northwestern and Pacific Railway, laying track westward from Denver toward the divide, pushing grade-up canyons and along ridges that engineers had called impractical. The line reached the foothills, climbed through rugged canyons, and then, because no tunnel yet existed, was forced to top the divide at Rollins Pass. The pass was the only way through without a tunnel, and the pass was a nightmare. Grades on the approach exceeded 4% in places, meaning locomotives hauling freight had to fight gravity so steep that helper engines were required on nearly every train. In summer, the crossing was merely exhausting. In winter, it was lethal. Snowfalls of 20 feet were not unusual. The wind across the open saddle regularly exceeded 100 miles per hour. Snow sheds, rotary plows, and armies of men with shovels could not keep the line open reliably. Moffat watched his railroad hemorrhage money every winter, the operating costs of the pass eating the line's revenues down to nothing. He knew, with the clarity of a man watching his investment dissolve, that the only real answer was a tunnel, a hole straight through the mountain, low enough to sit below the worst weather, straight enough to eliminate the tortuous climbing, long enough to make the crossing a matter of minutes instead of hours. He sought financing for the rest of his life. He never found it. David Moffat died in 1911, broke, having spent his fortune on a railroad that still could not get through the mountain. The tunnel was an idea without a dollar behind it. It would sit that way for more than a decade. What Moffat could not accomplish as a private financier, Colorado would eventually attempt as a public enterprise. In 1922, the state legislature created the Moffat Tunnel Improvement District, a special taxing authority empowered to issue bonds backed by the property of the citizens of 6 counties. The tunnel would be a public work, paid for not by a railroad baron, but by the farmers, merchants, and homeowners of northern Colorado. The politics were contentious. Critics called it a boondoggle, a hole in the ground that would swallow public money and might never reach the other side. Supporters argued that the economic future of Denver and the entire region depended on it. The bond issue passed. In 1923, crews broke ground. The plan was staggering in its simplicity, and its ambition bore 2 tunnels through James Peak, one for the railroad and a smaller pilot tunnel alongside it for ventilation and geological reconnaissance. The railroad tunnel would be just over 6 miles long, 32,700 feet, driven through solid granite at an elevation that finally sat below the kill zone of Rollins Pass. It would be the longest railroad tunnel in the Western Hemisphere at the time of its conception. There was no precedent for this scale of work in the American West. The Swiss had bored through the Alps, the Americans were about to bore through the Rockies, and they were about to discover that the mountain had opinions of its own. Here is what the engineers feared before a single stick of dynamite was detonated. They did not know what was inside the mountain. Geological surveys could sample the surface, could read the exposed rock on either side of James Peak, could make educated guesses about what lay between. But until the drills entered the granite and advanced into the dark, no one could be certain whether the rock would be solid and stable or fractured and saturated, whether the tunnel would pass through competent stone or hit a fault zone full of water under pressure. The mountain was a black box. The only way to find out what was inside was to go inside, and the only way to go inside was to send men. The work began from both ends simultaneously and from intermediate shafts, so that multiple crews could drive toward each other from different points, shortening the total time. Each heading was a face of raw rock, lit by carbide lamps and the bare bulbs strung on wires along the tunnel walls, a wall of stone that had to be attacked with drills and explosives, broken into rubble, loaded into muck cars, and hauled out on narrow-gauge rails before the next round of drilling could begin. The cycle was relentless. Drill, charge, blast, clear, support, advance. Drill, charge, blast, clear, support, advance. Every shift was a repetition of that same violent conversation between human intention and geological resistance. The drills were pneumatic, compressed air machines that drove steel bits into the rock in a stammering, deafening assault that filled the tunnel with a vibration you felt in your teeth and your chest before you heard it in your ears. The noise was extraordinary. Men worked in a sound field that left their ears ringing for hours after they surfaced, a constant hammering that never stopped as long as a heading was active. When the holes were drilled, the powder men packed them with dynamite, gelatin dynamite, fast-burning and powerful, wired the charges, and everyone retreated down the tunnel to a safe distance. The blast was a concussive thud that traveled through the rock like a drumbeat, followed by a rush of foul air and dust that billowed out of the heading like smoke from a cannon. Then the muckers went in. They shoveled the broken rock by hand, or guided it into mechanical loaders, filled the muck cars, and sent the small train of rubble rolling out into the daylight, while the timbering crew moved in to set supports, posts, caps, and lagging of rough-sawn timber braced against the freshly exposed rock to hold the ceiling where the mountain wanted to fall. And then the cycle began again. In a good shift, they advanced 12 feet. In a bad one, they advanced nothing, or they went backward, pulling out collapsed timber, clearing rock that had fallen where men had been standing an hour before. The men who did this work were not abstractions. They were miners, tunnel workers, and hard rock laborers drawn from the mining camps of Colorado and the industrial cities of the East, men who had worked underground before and understood what it meant. They were paid well by the standards of the day, but the wage bought a specific kind of life. They lived in construction camps at the tunnel portals, collections of frame shacks and canvas tents pitched at the mouths of the bore, where the air smelled of creosote, diesel exhaust, and the acrid chemical tang of dynamite. The camps were crowded, cold, and loud. Shifts ran around the clock, which meant that men trying to sleep during the day did so while the drilling continued a few hundred yards away, and the ventilation fans pushed a constant draft of tunnel air through the camp. The work itself was physical, in a way that is difficult to convey to a modern reader. A man handling a pneumatic drill, in a heading 8 feet wide and 10 feet high, was working in a space barely larger than a closet, with rock dust filling the air so thickly that the lamp on his helmet illuminated a cone of white particles, not a wall of stone. The dust was granite. It was silica, and it was going into his lungs with every breath. The mountain, as the engineers had feared, was not cooperative. The first major fault zone hit the tunnel little more than a mile in from the east portal. A fault zone, in tunnel construction, is not a crack. It is a region of shattered, broken rock, often saturated with water under enormous hydrostatic pressure, where the stone has been ground and fractured by geological forces over millions of years until it has the consistency of gravel suspended in mud. When the heading entered the fault, the rock above began to move. Timber supports snapped, groundwater poured in, not a trickle but a flow, sometimes a torrent, cold enough to numb a man's hands in minutes, and voluminous enough to fill the bore knee-deep in the lower stretches. The pumps could not keep up. The timbering crews were now building not just supports but barriers, walls of timber and concrete and grout, pumped under pressure to seal the face and hold back the water, while the drills tried to advance. Progress in the fault zones dropped from 12 feet a shift to 12 feet a week. Sometimes it went negative. The mountain would push in faster than the men could hold it back, and weeks of advance would collapse into rubble in a single shift. The worst section was a zone of running ground that the crews called the surge, a body of saturated sand and fractured rock that behaved more like a liquid than a solid, flowing into the tunnel as fast as it could be excavated. At one point, the flow was so severe that the heading was abandoned and the tunnel was rerouted around the worst of it, adding length and cost to the project. The fault zones were the hidden tax the mountain levied on every foot of progress, and they were the reason the tunnel took 4 years instead of 2, and cost more than anyone had projected, and killed men who were standing in the wrong place when the ground decided to move. And then there was the gas. Carbon monoxide accumulated in the tunnel after every blast, a colorless, invisible poison that killed not by explosion but by displacement, binding to the blood's hemoglobin faster than oxygen, silencing the body's chemistry until a man simply sat down, felt sleepy, and stopped breathing. The ventilation system, massive fans at the portals forcing fresh air through pipes to the active headings, was the difference between life and death on every shift, and it was imperfect. Men were carried out of the tunnel unconscious, revived in the open air, and sent back down the next day. Silica dust accumulated in the lungs of every man who worked the headings, a slow accumulation that would, years later, manifest as silicosis, a scarring of the lung tissue that left men gasping for breath, unable to work, slowly suffocating over years. No one measured the dust, no one issued respirators that worked. The disease was a cost that would not appear on any ledger until long after the tunnel was finished and the crews had scattered. 28 men died building the Moffat Tunnel. Some were killed by rock falls, their bodies pulled from collapsed timber with fractures and crushed limbs. Some were killed by blasting accidents, premature detonations, misfires, a powder man in the wrong place when the charge went. Some were killed by the train that hauled muck out of the bore, struck in the dark by a car they did not see coming. Some were killed by gas. The deaths were recorded, the families notified, the work continued. There was no alternative. The tunnel had to go through. The mountain would not negotiate. The financial pressure mounted alongside the physical danger. The Moffat Tunnel Improvement District had sold bonds to finance construction, and those bonds carried interest that accumulated with every month of delay. Every fault zone, every collapse, every week of slow progress was not just an engineering problem, but a fiscal one, the cost of the project rising with every setback, the burden on the taxpayers of the 6 counties growing heavier. There were moments when the entire enterprise teetered, the bond market fluctuated, critics in the state legislature renewed their attacks, pointing to the delays and the deaths as proof that the project had been a mistake from the start. The railroad that would use the tunnel, the Denver and Salt Lake, successor to Moffat's bankrupt line, was itself barely solvent, its revenues still drained by the operating costs of Rollins Pass, even as the tunnel that would replace the pass ate its way through the mountain. The financing held, but only barely, and only because the alternative, abandoning a partially completed tunnel and continuing to run trains over the pass forever, was worse than any cost. By the time the two headings finally approached each other deep inside James Peak, the project had become something more than an engineering exercise. It had become a test of whether public investment and human endurance could outlast the resistance of a mountain that had been fighting back for 4 years. The breakthrough came in 1927. The east heading and the west heading, driven toward each other from opposite sides of the mountain, met with a precision that still staggers the imagination. When the final wall of rock was blasted through and the two crews could see each other's lights through the opening, the alignment was off by less than 1.5 inches. Surveyors working from both portals, using transit instruments and astronomical observations, had guided 2 tunnels through 6 miles of solid granite and brought them together with an accuracy that would be remarkable even in the age of laser-guided boring machines. That alignment was not luck. It was the product of months of triangulation, calculation, and correction, every heading checked and rechecked against the survey lines, every blast planned to maintain the grade and the curve that the engineers had specified. The men who held the transits were as essential to the tunnel as the men who held the drills, and their work was what made the breakthrough possible. The tunnel was completed, tested, and opened to rail traffic in 1928. The first train rolled through the bore in February of that year, descending through the mountain instead of climbing over it. The crossing of the Continental Divide, which had taken hours of grueling ascent and descent over Rollins Pass, hours of fighting snow, wind, grade, and exhaustion, now took approximately 11 minutes. 11 minutes in the dark, behind a locomotive, through 6 miles of engineered stone, and then daylight on the other side. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, the engineering, the human cost, the things we build and then forget, consider subscribing. There are more of these, and each one goes deeper. The economic effect was immediate and profound. The Moffat Tunnel eliminated the operating costs of Rollins Pass, the helper engines, the snow-clearing armies, the delays, the wrecks, the lost cargo. Freight rates dropped. Travel times between Denver and Salt Lake City collapsed. Denver, which had been a rail terminus, became a rail corridor, a through point on a line that finally connected the plains to the Great Basin without detour. The tunnel also carried water. A separate bore, the pilot tunnel driven alongside the main bore for ventilation and surveying, was repurposed as an aqueduct, carrying water from the western slope of the divide to the eastern slope and supplying the growing cities of the Front Range with a resource that would become more valuable than any railroad could measure. The tunnel was not just a passage for trains, it was a piece of infrastructure that reshaped the economic and hydrological geography of Colorado. The railroad that Moffat had built and gone, broke trying to complete, was absorbed into larger systems, eventually becoming part of the Denver and Rio Grande Western, and later still, part of the Union Pacific. The line through the tunnel carried coal, freight, and passengers for decades. It still does. What remains today is both visible and invisible. The east portal of the Moffat Tunnel, on the side of the mountain facing Denver, is a concrete arch set into the hillside, flanked by the frame buildings of the rail yards, marked by a sign that reads simply with the tunnel's name. Trains still enter it, the bore is still in service, carrying Union Pacific freight and Amtrak's California Zephyr through the divide, on a schedule that has, in its bones, changed very little since 1928. The tracks inside are maintained, the ventilation still functions, the tunnel still does exactly what it was built to do. Rollins Pass, the route the tunnel replaced, is still there too, a dirt road now, not a rail line, threading across the same saddle of wind-scoured rock where trains once fought blizzards and men burned snowsheds to survive. In summer, you can drive to the top and stand where the trains stood and feel the wind that never stopped, and look south toward the mass of James Peak and know that somewhere inside that mountain, 6 miles of granite have a hole through them. You will not see it. You will not hear it. But if you stand there long enough, a train will pass beneath your feet, and the ground will carry a faint vibration, the movement of steel wheels on rail, passing through a bore that was paid for in bonds and built in blood. The names of the 28 men who died are recorded in the archives of the Tunnel District, in newspaper clippings, in the dry language of accident reports that reduce catastrophe to a line of statistics. They were miners and muckers and powder men and timber workers. They came from places that the tunnel was supposed to connect: Colorado, the mining towns of the West, the industrial cities of the East. They went into a mountain that had never been opened, and some of them did not come out. Their work is not marked inside the tunnel. There is no plaque at the fault zones where the ground collapsed. There is no memorial at the heading where the gas collected. The tunnel itself is the memorial, 6 miles of stone with a hole through it, a hole that was made by men with drills and dynamite and compressed air and timber and their own hands and their own breath, working in noise and dust and darkness, paid by the day, forgotten by the decade. The modern world runs on infrastructure that most people never see and never think about. The train that carries freight through the Rockies today, the water that flows to the cities of the Front Range, the economic life of a state that depends on a connection through the mountains, all of it rests on a bore, through granite, that was driven by men who are gone. The tunnel is still there, the mountain is still there, the labor that joined them is what holds them together, and it is the part of the story that the mountain will never give back.